بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على محمد النبي الأمين وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن اتبعه بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. As always, we start in the name of Allah, the most beneficent, the most compassionate, the most merciful, the Lord of the heavens and earth, the eternal, the one and only, the one who is indivisible, without equals, without a wife, without a son. And we pray for blessings, peace and blessings upon the Prophet Muhammad and his family and his companions, and upon all those who followed in the footsteps of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, believing him and affirming his message. And we also pray for peace and blessings upon all the prophets of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, from the very beginning till our very day. اللهم اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. In the previous Jumu'ahs, we have conveyed a variety of lessons, and inshallah my intention is to add another one to these lessons. But each of these lessons is extremely valuable in and of itself, and if those lessons are put together in a consistent and systematic way and internalized, they might even help us as Muslims transform our reality so that the purity and the poignancy and the power of our faith can return to its luster and to its pristine freshness. In past Jumu'ahs, for instance, we talked about a rather obvious point, but a point that contemporary Muslims always ignore, that all the messages of the prophets, all the prophets of Allah, always came invariably, without exception, to be a voice for the dispossessed against the empowered. All the prophets come to people who are mustadafina fil ard, people who are oppressed, and they speak for the oppressed against the oppressor. This theme is consistent and basic to Risalat al-Tawheed, the message of monotheism, the same message that Allah has sent repeatedly, time and time again, with every prophet. If any of you have read, especially the Old Testament, the Torah, one of the major disagreements that we Muslims have with the Torah is the fact that it conveys, or it talks about the prophets of God alayhimus salam as people who at times partook not just in power, not only became powerful kings, but also indulged in the sins of power. So David and Solomon, and there's several other examples in the Old Testament which position the prophets as people who can become sufficiently empowered as to commit injustices and transgress upon the rights of others. In Islam, that narrative is completely rejected. And when we talk about the role of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, Muslims who understand the political role of the Prophet ﷺ after migrating from Mecca and Medina as an exemplar of a ruler who ruled with absolute justice and an unrelenting effort to empower the disempowered and stand against the empowered are very different in their understanding of Islam from those who imagine that as a leader and a ruler, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was not restrained by moral precepts and was not constrained by a strict ethical paradigm. One of the reasons that those who fell in love with the Prophet ﷺ is because of his mercy and his compassion and his justice and his social empathy and his uncorrupted character as a ruler. Another lesson, which is a critical one, is that even in the existence of the Prophet ﷺ in his lifetime, when Muslims would enter into a covenant with the Prophet ﷺ, part of that covenant would be that they will speak up for truth. And even in the presence of the Prophet, that they don't surrender their free will to even the Prophet of Allah. Although the Qur'an tells Muslims that وَأَطِيعُوا اللَّهَ وَأَطِيعُوا الرَّسُولَ, obey Allah and obey the Prophet, but that even the equation of obedience did not require them to relinquish their right to speak up for justice and righteousness and to stand up for principles. In other words, following the Prophet ﷺ did not include erasing their own intellect and their own heart and their own personality. If Muslims reflect upon that lesson, it would solve so many pedantic issues that they get stuck on. It would remind them that essential to their khilafah on earth, essential to their this agency on earth on behalf of Allah, is that their conscience must be always sharp and lively and active, and at no point are they allowed to dull their conscience and simply say, well, we follow orders. This moral agency is what distinguishes the message of the Qur'an from the Christianity, especially the Christianity that existed pre-Islam and during the medieval era, where a person's moral agency was supposed to be surrendered to the church, and also distinguishes it from Judaism before Islam and Judaism in the medieval era, where moral agency was surrendered and turned over to the rabbinic class. And that is why the Qur'an is very critical of the role of the rabbinic class, because they demanded that human beings surrender moral agency to them. Now, of course, in Judaism, many things take place, but in due time comes a major reformer who is heavily influenced by Muslim thinkers, Maimonides, who interacts with the Jewish tradition and attempts to restore moral agency in the Jewish tradition despite the rabbinic class. And Christianity has its own history of reform. It is time for us Muslims, now it is time for us Muslims to rethink the ways that we have lost moral agency and we have surrendered moral agency, and to engage in our own self-reform and our own self-revisions. Because although the Qur'an and our tradition is very clear about the role of moral agency, we often act as if we can surrender our moral agency to a set of literal injunctions written verbatim in a book. So we think that it is enough to read hadith, and that hadith becomes the bearer of our moral agency, and we don't have to worry about things anymore. And that's extremely dangerous, because without moral agency, you don't have real believers. It's like when Allah talks to the kuffar of Quraysh, and when the kuffar of Quraysh say, why didn't he send an angel? If this is a true message from Allah, why didn't Allah send an angel? And Allah responds to this in the Qur'an by saying, people, if I would have sent an angel, it would be all over. It would be all done. Why so? Because the act of moral agency and voluntariness would be meaningless. You can't disbelieve a physical presence like an angel. The reason I can continue to give you moral agency as human beings is because I've sent a prophet who is a human being. And as a human being, you still, مَنْ شَاءَ فَلْيُؤْمِنْ وَمَنْ شَاءَ فَلْيَكْفُرْ. You still have the agency of whether to believe or not to believe. But remember that even after believing, there is a great amount of moral agency that comes in the challenge of nifaq, in the challenge of hypocrisy, and in the challenge of shirk, associating partners with Allah. Because shirk itself is shirkun jali, an obvious shirk, when you say that Allah has a son, when you say that Allah, there's two gods instead of one, when you say that there are a God of wind, earth, that's shirkun bawah or shirkun jali, that's an obvious shirk. When you, in your heart, worship money more than Allah, that's shirkun khafi. That's hidden shirk. So even after Iman, your moral agency, the challenge of moral agency is still there because of the challenge of shirk. And nifaq, hypocrisy, is very stealth. We are hypocrites. Often we become hypocritical within our families, within our friendships, within our jobs. We say something and we do something different. We expect something from others that we don't expect from us. These are all forms of hypocrisy. And moral agency is critical. We also learned from these Jumu'ahs that the nature of tyrants and oppressors is to accuse their opponents of the worst crimes. So the Pharaoh accuses Moses of being what? Of being a terrorist. And part of your moral agency, and we've talked about this quite a bit already, but as a recap, if you as a Muslim can look at the powerful and look at the disempowered, and you sympathize with the powerful against the disempowered, and you believe the powerful when they start accusing the disempowered of the most ugly crimes, and ifsad fil ard, like Pharaoh accused Moses, then there is something wrong. Something wrong in your spirit, something wrong in your intellect, and something wrong in your iman, in the understanding of your faith. Inshallah, today we add another element in this critical understanding of our faith and why Islam and the power of Islam, which is manifested through the power of the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Qur'an. أَلَا يَتَدَبَّرُونَ Qur'an. Don't they reflect on the Qur'an? Among the most awe-inspiring passages in the Qur'an, and of course, you know, the minute you say that, you start thinking of so many other passages, because the Qur'an is just full of hikmah and wisdom. When Allah tells us, فَمَنْ يُرِدِ اللَّهُ بِهِ خَيْرًا فَمَنْ يُرِدِ اللَّهُ أَنْ يَهْدِيهِ يشرح صدره للإسلام ومن يرد أن يضله يجعل صدره ضيقا حرجا كأنما يصعد في السماء كذلك يجعل الله الرجس على الذين لا يؤمنون وهذا صراط ربك مستقيما قد فصلنا الآيات لقوم يذكرون. So the English is roughly, start with this. The English roughly is whoever God wishes to guide. It is as if God expands his or her chest to Islam, and whoever he wishes to leave astray, he makes his chest narrow and constricted, as if he or she were climbing up to the sky. And this is the righteous way of your Lord. Indeed, we have expounded the signs to people who would be admonished. The mark of faith, is that feeling of repose and tranquility in the chest. that you are straying away from Allah, or that is something, to be even more blunt, that there is something unbalanced in your moral character and your spiritual character, is the angst that you feel in your chest. Now, there are so many things that we can talk about in an ayah like this. But note is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when Allah points us to the nature of Islam, it's that repose and tranquility, the removal of the angst from your chest, the removal of that sense of anxiety, the sense of umph and turbulence from your chest. And the sign of a defect, like an illness, like a marad, like when you're ill, you ache, you get a fever. Well, in the level of spirituality, the sign of the illness is that percolation in your chest of an angst, of an anxiety. Now, how about those who claim to have Iman and have Islam, but in their chest there is a constant state of angst? Now, think about how far this goes. When Allah tells us that those that Allah wishes to guide to Islam, God helps them, filling in the theological gaps, God helps them so that there is repose and peace in their heart. Allah helps only those who help themselves. So it is not a matter of it is not a lottery system that has no reason or logic to it. That idea should be clearly set aside. Allah doesn't just play favorites for no reason. Allah ahkamul hakimin, Allah is the most wise and Allah is the most just. So if you want to test your own Iman, the first step to doing so is to check your angst. How does your chest feel? If you are always anxious and worried, then there is an illness in the relationship. There is a lack of trust in what Allah brings. If you're always full of anger and a desire to avenge yourself, then there is an illness in the chest. Even worse, if you hurt human beings and you know that they go home and raise their hands to Allah and say, Allah, punish the zalim, punish the oppressor, and they mean you, then your heart would be full of angst. Often people deal with this sense of angst by treating it with drugs, alcohol, distractions, games, sex. It is the same illness, and human beings respond to it, but also people deal with this angst by acquiring a lot of money, acquiring a lot of possessions, buying things, belonging to expensive clubs where they waste a tremendous amount of money. But note that ultimately Allah teaches us, as Allah tells the Prophet ﷺ, لَيْسَ عَلَيْكَ هُدَاهُمْ, it is not up to you who will be guided and who will not. I can tell you now that part of the critical understanding of Islam is that if a Muslim hurts someone else because they are not a believer, or because they think of them as a bad Muslim. In other words, if a Muslim kills another human being because they don't have huda, they don't have guidance in their heart, or because they think of them as bad Muslims, there is no two ways about it. That is a lack of faith. Because if Allah would have willed, that person would have been truly guided. When a Muslim does what people like in ISIS do and Qaeda do and so on, or even at lesser forms, even if you don't kill a person but you just hate a person because they're not a believer, it's a lack of faith, because Allah told you very clearly, this is up to Allah. If you don't believe me, I learned a few days ago that the producer of the documentary Fitna, if you remember, there was a documentary called Fitna that came out after 9/11, a horrible piece of propaganda against Islam. The producer of that documentary became Muslim, converted to Islam, and he has many videos on YouTube talking about how he became Muslim. And as I was listening to his interviews, this ayah kept repeating in my mind. Everything he talked about is how his heart was full of angst after finishing that documentary Fitna, and how upon deciding to just read the Qur'an, his heart was full of inshirah, that tranquility that is a gift from Allah. It is as if Allah said, you worked very hard in hating me, but I love you. And you read the Qur'an, and I will reward you by touching your heart. That same person that I saw years ago in 2006 or 7 on some videos, and I just thought, what a devil. When I watched his videos this week, I thought to myself, God, his face is full of light, full of beauty. What a beautiful human being. He used to be a part of the Geert Wilders party in the Netherlands. He left that party and started a new party based on Islamic principles called the Unity Party in the Netherlands. As a Muslim, pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to fill your heart with that tranquility and repose, because you will shine outwardly. And to remove the angst in your heart, whether the angst is there because you worry about your future, whether because you're angry at your wife or husband, whether because you have political problems, the angst is from the devil. And the repose and peace is from the divine. But I want to take a step back and point your attention to another element in Surah Al-An'am. Every surah in the Qur'an is full of wisdom, and each surah has a personality, an ethical personality that is as distinct, that is, well, I'm not sure as distinct as what, but that is very distinct, like the planets that form the solar system. Each surah is a part of the ethical totality that is presented to Muslims. So before Allah tells us, يشرح صدره للإسلام, And note just a passive thing, when Allah describes those who Allah doesn't guide and says that their chest becomes tight, full of angst. كالذي يصعد في السماء, that who goes up on earth. Now, of course, in our modern age, we know that as you rise in the heavens, the more you rise, the less oxygen there is, and the more you become, you suffocate. And interestingly, when this surah, this ayah was revealed, the Muslims, commentators, the Ahl Tafsir, weren't quite sure what does it mean. Why is it that when someone, because they didn't know that there's less oxygen the higher you go. And so they said, well, subhanAllah, we're not sure what Allah means when it says, rises in the heavens, and so they become choked up and can't breathe. Well, now, in the modern age, we found out what that means, is that the higher you go, the less oxygen there is, and so that's why Allah uses the form yas'adu, not yas'adu. Yas'adu, which means continues to rise. So the more you can rise, the more you suffocate. The Qur'an, again, is full of these indications that the author of this book had a complete awareness of the sciences that we discovered centuries later. So before Allah introduces us to this, though, Allah says, أو من كان ميتا فأحييناه وجعلنا له نورا يمشي به في الناس كمن مثله في الظلمات ليس بخارج منها كذلك زين للكافرين ما كانوا يعملون وكذلك جعلنا في كل قرية أكابر مجرميها ليمكروا فيها وما يمكرون إلا بأنفسهم وما يشعرون وإذا جاءتهم آية قالوا لن نؤمن حتى نؤتى مثل ما أوتي رسل الله الله أعلم حيث يجعل رسالته and so on. So, the translation first. Is he who is dead, then we gave him life and bestowed upon him a light by which he is able to walk in the right way among people, like the one who is blundering about in darkness and will not come out of it. So was made alluring to the unbelievers that which they were doing. And so we have placed in every town chiefs of the wicked to spread the snare of their vile schemes. But they themselves become entangled in their snares, and they do not realize it. And if a sign comes to them, they say, we will not believe until we are given the like of what was given to the messengers of God. God knows best with whom to entrust his message, and so on. Now, this ayah, though, again, there are so many things that one could address in this, but the image of a Muslim being as if alive, those who turn towards Allah are the ones who are truly alive, and alive with light. And those who turn away, it's as if they're dead. And I've talked about this notion in several khutbahs before, but I want to focus on another thing in this ayah that people don't usually notice. Allah tells us who posed the greatest danger to light and the biggest attraction towards darkness. أكابر مجرميها. The most powerful, the most rich are always the ones who, at the same time that their hearts are full of angst and lack of tranquility they are also the ones that often are the cause of the most corruption. But note here, of course, we think of the most corruption meaning, well, they're very powerful, so they're unfair, they're unjust, they're oppressive. Yes, all of that. But note how Allah points our attention to something quite critical. وَإِذَا جَاءَتْهُمْ آيَةٌ قَالُوا لَن نُؤْمِنَ حَتَّى نُؤْتَى مِثْلِ مَا أُوتِيَ. When they come to prophets, they say, no, we will not believe unless we have an honored status like these prophets. Now, most Muslims read this and say, oh, well, okay, it means that they're jealous of Muhammad as the Prophet, ﷺ, and they maybe wonder why weren't they picked as prophets. You know, the rich people are entitled, and they say, well, you know, we're rich, we should have been the prophets. Well, not quite. It does include that, but that's not the critical point. نُؤْتَى مِثْلِ مَا أُوتِيَ رُسُلُ اللَّهِ. They want the legislative and executive powers of the prophets of God. The source of their corruption is that even when they become believers, or when they do become believers, because they are haughty and arrogant, they effectively then use the message of the prophets to empower themselves by demanding the doctrine of obedience that effectively makes them the people obeyed in society. Look at every tyrant. Very few tyrants, there are, but very few, will completely destroy the idea of God in society. Stalin, sure, but that's a communist creed and so on. Rather, what tyrants want is to have the legislative and executive powers that prophets had. So they embrace the religious establishment, but then demand obedience to themselves. So even we find this among so many modern Muslims around the world. They will say, "Ati'u Allah, obey God, wa ati'u Rasul, and the Prophet, wa ulil amri minkum," which they understand as, and the rulers, as if obeying God and the Prophet and the rulers are all equal. What the earmark of the injustice that erases the tranquility in the heart and teaches people hypocrisy and teaches people this, creates that heaviness in the chest. The earmark of that is when rulers usurp the power of Allah and usurp the power of the Prophet ﷺ, or prophets in society. They teach people the doctrine was al-Madakhiliyya and Jamiyya, these two schools of thought now supported by all the rich Muslim countries and poor Muslim countries, which basically teaches that you obey Allah, you obey the Prophet, but you obey the ruler, so much so that even if the ruler commands something against what Allah commanded or the Prophet commanded, you should still obey the ruler. And they tell you why. They tell you, well, because we fear fitna, we fear bid'ah, whatever justification. Effectively, the only paradigm of obedience in society becomes what? Obeying the ruler. That's the only effective paradigm. So, for instance, in so many authoritarian countries, like Egypt, Egypt, you can appear on Egyptian TV, say the most awful, god-awful things about the Prophet ﷺ, about the companions. You can trash the companions, you can sit there and talk about the Qur'an, you can trash the Qur'an, you can trash Islamic history, you can say this is a history of that is backwards and reactionary and retarded. No problem. You can do that. But you can't criticize Sisi. I saw an interview with Noel Saadawi. She was sitting there. She gave a long lecture. Noel Saadawi is an Egyptian feminist. Horrible. Long lecture about how we should be able to criticize the Qur'an. We should be able to criticize the Sunnah. We should be able to criticize, which, fine, I agree. She should be able. But then the person interviewing her did something that got her fired. She said, well, would you also be willing to criticize Sisi? Nawal Saadawi had a fit. So you invited me here to criticize Sisi? I will leave. I will leave. And of course they fired the poor journalist that asked her that question. Syria. You can say whatever you want about the Sunnah, about the companions. You can trash them. You can say, I am a secularist, I am an atheist, but you can't say a word about Assad. Not a word. These are precisely what the Qur'an is telling you, warning you about. Those rich people, the mutrafiq qawm, the rich and powerful in society, they demand the authority of prophets. And if you can't keep straight the authority of the prophets from human authority, then it is inevitable that the illness, al-marad, the illness will inhabit your heart. The same, by the way, applies for Muslims who look at someone like Trump, because there are Muslims who have actually written me about this. Say, well, Trump, we have to obey and we should cooperate even with an unjust ruler because that's a ruler and Allah ordered us to. You allow a despot who has a long history with prostitution and sexual abuses to become your effective God when you adhere to the doctrine of ta'ah, to the doctrine of obedience, and take away your moral agency. The problem is not obeying. I obey the law as an American citizen, but I obey the law as an institution in which I partake. My allegiance is to the law, not to the president, to the law. Because the law represents a symbol, it's a justice. But my real boss, other than the law, is Allah and the Prophet ﷺ. I don't give my moral agency away to anyone. When you decide that your allegiance is to a human being, that you obey without exercising your moral agency, it's as if like you gave the bay'ah to the Prophet ﷺ, but did not agree like the prophets did, like the companions did, as I talked about in the past, to stand up for truth. Remember, the companions would give their bay'ah to the Prophet that they will obey him, but they will also stand up for truth. نقول قولة الحق لا نخشى في الله لومة لائم. That we will not allow fear. So even with the Prophet, we don't give up our moral agency. So how about another human being? Learn, because these elements is what the enemies of Islam use to try to create doubt in our youth, to try to tell our children, the religion your parents belong to is backwards and retarded. The guy that just became the Prime Minister of Britain, what's his name?
Boris Johnson.
He has a book on Rome. At the end of the book on Rome, Muslims don't read, and that's the problem. He has an appendix. The appendix is about Islam. He sits there and he talks about how his great-grandfather was a Muslim and blah, 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 and so on and so forth. But the most important part, he praises Churchill and praises Churchill's understanding of the Muslim world. And says, the problem with the Muslim world is Islam. Because Islam held Muslims back, and Islam is a despotic religion that prevents its followers from understanding the basics of liberty. Of course, who is he relying on? He's relying on our idiotic Muslim brothers and sisters who go around teaching about ta'ah, obedience. Allah warned us. The most corrupt in town are going to be those powerful rich who want an authority co-equal to the authority of the prophets. Allah warned us. Don't give away your moral agency because it will benefit you nothing in the hereafter. You will not be able to say in the hereafter, well, I did this sin because Trump told me, because Sisi told me, because Assad told me, because MBS told me, because MBZ told me. It will help you nothing. Islam is the religion of brave, meticulous, moral agency. Teach that to your children. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم. اللهم اعف عنا وارحمنا واغفر لنا يا رب العالمين. لا إله إلا أنت العلي العظيم. وصلي وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن اتبعه بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. There is so much that goes on every week, and of course there's no hope of touching even just a little about on all that is important and relevant. However, there are a couple of things that have caught my attention that are worth bringing up. Recently, there is a U.S. citizen called Reem Mohammed al-Dasu'i who went to Egypt because she had some official papers she needed to finish. She's a U.S. citizen. She's been living in the United States for a long time. Her son is an American citizen and 12 years old who was born in the U.S. She goes to Egypt. She stopped at the airport upon her arrival and she is arrested. And why is she arrested? Because she has on her Facebook posts about the human rights abuses in Egypt. The government arrests her, keeps her in the airport for 18 hours, separates her child from her. They take her to somewhere that's unknown, and then the 12-year-old child is turned over to another American Egyptian family in Egypt who eventually fly him back to the US. Alhamdulillah, at least, if this was Syria, I'm sure the 12-year-old would have been arrested with the mother and disappeared in prison as well. Now, this bothers me not just as a Muslim, but as an American citizen. The woman first disappears, no one knows where she is. Eventually, it's confirmed that not only is she arrested, but that she is being charged. And charged with what? she's charged with belonging to the Muslim Brotherhood, although there is no evidence that this woman ever had anything to do with the Muslim Brotherhood. The only thing she has done is put posts on her Facebook about violations, human rights violations in Egypt, and of spreading false news about Egypt. The accusations that every pharaoh uses: you've insulted me, you've insulted my majesty, how dare you insult my majesty? And now she actually is being charged, and if the way in Egypt there's no independent judiciary, and she will be convicted like everyone else who is ever arrested and accused of similar accusations. Now, you sit and you imagine the devastation upon this poor family, the poor 12-year-old, the poor mother. And again, all the people that speak up about something like this are human rights organizations. Muslims, for the most part, are completely silent. It's as if the amount of ugliness in their lives have rendered them immune to shock or offense. But when they become like that, they are no longer true Muslims. Our children, one of the first things they learn is the evangelists, and I've been reading a lot about evangelism and missionary work in the Muslim world. Go and tell our children about how much injustice is committed by Muslims against Muslims. And then they tell our children, look, did you ever hear your parents react? Did you ever hear them outraged? Well, they really never talked about it. They avoid these topics. Do you know why? Because in Islam, this is not considered bad. In Islam, it's okay to arrest people, to frame people, to throw them away in prison. This is why, and when are Muslims going to wake up? Do you know the biggest defenders of Sisi and MBS and MBZ? The biggest defenders is the right-wing fascist Netanyahu and his government, who recently praised Sisi's great wisdom, and Islamophobic organizations. In my little thing with the Islamic Center of Southern California, who came to the defense of the Islamic Center of Southern California? Who attacked me for wanting to say something about Morsi and supported the moral uprightness of the Islamic Center of Southern California Islamophobic organizations, including the Clarion Project? That should speak volumes. When people who hate Islam jump on someone who speaks about justice and human rights and say bravo to Muslims who are silent about injustice and suffering and oppression, if that doesn't awake you, if that doesn't bring some life into your moral conscience, then there is no hope. Reflect on that. Who published article after article attacking me and praising the Islamic Center of Southern California? Go on the net and see. This should be a moral education, a moment of deep reflection. Every time we confront injustice with silence, those who hate Islam celebrate. When the Muslims of China suffer the way they suffer, and only non-Muslim countries come to their defense, and all Muslim countries, or most Muslim countries, actually support the oppression, the way that comes to our children is, look at this loser religion. Look at the religion of your parents. They stand by injustice. They don't even care about their own kind. So what do you think they're going to care about non-Muslims? If they can't even be humane towards their own kind. But I will tell you, with not a shadow of doubt, if I am the last Muslim on the face of this earth, and I'm not, but if I was, it doesn't shake my face one iota, because I know that the Islam that I believe in and teach is the only true Islam. That Islam that condones concentration camps from fellow Muslims is false. The Islam that turns over political asylees, Qatar turned in a political asylee to Saudi, and so did Kuwait. The Islam that doesn't protect a political asylee is not a true Islam. An Islam that oppresses, arrests people for just criticizing a ruler. If this woman Reem had on her Facebook, like a lot of Egyptians these days have, cusses and curses against the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, no one would have touched her. No one would have said anything to her. But you can curse Allah, you can curse the Prophet, but you can't curse Sisi. That is a false Islam. You are not going to be able to raise your head in front of your children unless you declare very openly with me that this is not a real Islam. Your children will grow to not respect you because you're not a role model. You're a moral coward. And our children will not respect moral cowards. Do what you want about Sisi and all of that, but I am telling you, in the same way that kid, the 12-year-old Reem al-Dasui's child, when Reem al-Dasui is sitting there in her prison suffering, she will raise her hands and do dua to Allah, and you know that the dua al-mazloom, the dua of the oppressed, is heard by Allah. And you know Allah will punish all of those who remain silent in their children. When your children grow up and they're not Muslim, and you sit there and say, why Allah? Remember this. Remember that you left Reem al-Dasui and her suffering and the suffering of her 12-year-old, and did not even support her with a tweet, with a message. Even didn't support her in your heart. It's an example. I don't know Reem al-Dasui. I've never met her. But I looked at her case file. She has nothing to do with the Ikhwan, never has. And like a lot of Muslims, anyone that opposes a ruler these days in the Muslim world, they get accused of being Ikhwan. And by implication, the terrorists. I'm going to close with a nice story, but I think a really heart-wrenching one, and one that really touched me. To see real Islam, the true Islam, the beauty of Islam, you don't see that Islam in the annals of power and authority and oppression. You know that Idlib in Syria is being bombed every day, and there are civilians being slaughtered every single day. And the world, as usual, you know, the Russian government and the Syrian government are slaughtering women and children and men every single day in Idlib. Out of this immense suffering, Grace, my wife, introduced me to a group on Facebook called Little Hearts Coricini, Coricini. And this group, it's amazing. With total conviction that they're doing for the sake of Allah. They go around sheltering, feeding orphans, children whose parents have been killed. Not only do they shelter and feed them, but they sing with them, dance with them, draw with them. They put smiles on their faces. Then, in addition to that, as they're going amidst the rubble, collecting orphans from the streets, they find little kitten that is ill and suffering, and cats that are starving. And in an act of amazing beauty, they save the cats and they take the sick kitten to a vet. And the comment one of these brave men made on the video just broke my heart. He's holding the little kitten, the sick kitten that he's going to save. And he says, the Prophet taught us that if you save his life, that you've saved the entire earth and that your fate is Jannah. In the midst of the suffering and rubble, their Islam translates into, I dedicate my life. The bombs are falling on my head, and I'm sitting there teaching the children the alphabet, mathematics, and dancing and singing with them and drawing with them and saving animals, suffering animals on the streets. That is the real Islam. That is the true Islam. This man's heart, these men, I assure you, despite all the deaths and suffering, their hearts are full of repose, tranquility, and comfort. Not angst, not anxiety. This is where the true Islam, not the Islam of Sisi and the rich people and MBS and MBZ and all the other, the grotesque corruption that surrounds us everywhere. This is the Islam. The reason I mention their name is look them up. Donate money. Save your soul, because if they are doing their part, Allah will hold you responsible for the suffering of these orphans in the hereafter. They've given you a way out. I've never met them. I don't know them. I know that Grace donates money to them, but support taking care of suffering orphans and suffering animals. And this is the manifestation of the true and real Islam in life. Look them up. Little Hearts in Syria, Idlib. And show them that you can be a real Muslim as well. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم. اللهم اعف عنا. اللهم ارحمنا. اللهم اهدنا لأقرب من هذا الرشد يا رب العالمين. وانصر الإسلام وأعز المسلمين يا علي يا عظيم. Allah, forgive our sins. Guide us towards the straight path. Guide us to be closer to you and to be beloved by you and to love you in turn. Allah support us so that Islam is firmly anchored in our hearts and the hearts of our children and the children of their children. Ya Rabbal Alameen. Ameen. Ameen.